Now to a special report from our iTeam. Some Saskatchewan politicians have businesses on the side, numbered companies or holding companies. But here in this province, they're not required to tell you much of anything about them. Some people say that's a problem. The iTeam's Geoff Leo has been looking into this, and he joins me now. Geoff, what do we know about politicians and their businesses?
Well, we do know that many of them have businesses on the side. According to the law, that is perfectly fine here in Saskatchewan, but they do have to disclose that fact to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, along with their other investments. And he gets to look at everything and decide if politicians are in conflict of interest or whether they could be using their public position to benefit themselves or their families personally. And then he can advise them, once he knows all of that, on how to avoid a conflict.
Makes sense. So the commissioner knows about these businesses. What about us, the public?
So we only get to know a couple of things about the business that's owned by a politician. We get to know the name and its address. That's information that's published in annual disclosure statements from each MLA. But if it's a numbered company, knowing the name is not terribly helpful, as you can imagine. In several cases, cabinet ministers, for example, own a numbered company. So let's say it's 1234 Saskatchewan Limited, and they've got an address that's a law office. Doesn't really tell you much about that company or what it does, right? But that is all we get to know about many of these companies, and the Conflict of Interest Commissioner says that's all the public needs to know. He knows, and that should be sufficient.
Right, but some people disagree with that, I understand.
Yeah. Exactly. So I talked with an ethics specialist, Ian Stedman, and he says that for the sake of transparency, politicians should tell the public more about what their companies do, what assets they hold. He says even though they're not required to do that by law, they should do that, again, for the sake of transparency, because he says at this point, the current system, really, these politicians just have these black boxes of wonderful, he calls them, nondescript businesses, and we don't really know what's inside. He says we should, but the Conflict of Interest Commissioner and the government say the status quo is working just fine in this province.
Thank you so much, Geoff.
You're welcome.